This photograph is said to have been taken in the winter of 1944, somewhere inside a U.S. Army infirmary in Texas, but no one can say with certainty who pressed the shutter. Look closely. A German POW woman, her hair tangled from weeks of exhaustion, is crying. Tears of terror or relief? No one knows. Beside her stands an American officer, calm, focused, gently pulling a wooden comb through her knots. Why is he doing this? Why does she look as if she's bracing for pain that never comes? Who was this officer who chose compassion in the middle of a war built on fear? And why did prisoners later claim that this single moment changed everything we believed about America? Some say the photo documents an act of mercy. Others insist it hides a deeper, stranger truth. To understand what really happened that night, we must go back to the beginning. December 12, 1944. Camp Huntsville, Texas. The cold had settled into the wooden barracks like an uninvited guest, seeping into every crack, every nail, every soldier's breath. But the infirmary, Building 14B, held a different kind of chill. Not the winter kind, the war kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lived in the space between a heartbeat and a memory. The lights flickered with a buttery gold hue, softened by linen curtains that had once been crisp and white, but were now stained by months of sweat, fever, and the stubborn dust of Texas. The air smelled of antiseptic and soap, real soap, the American kind, smooth and plentiful. Nothing like the gray, crumbly substitute the German women had grown used to back home. Metal bed frames trembled whenever someone turned in their sleep, creating a faint clinking rhythm that rose and fell like a nervous pulse. On the far side of the ward, a cluster of German women lay curled under Army-issued wool blankets. They were exhausted in a way no fever chart could capture. Exhausted from the Atlantic crossing, from rationing, from months of laboring outdoors on details they never imagined doing before the war swallowed their lives whole. Their cheeks were hollow, their eyes sunken, their breath shallow. Dust still clung to their uniforms, fear still clung to their bones. And in the center of the room, illuminated by a lamp whose yellow glow cut a soft halo around him, stood an American officer, Captain Reynolds of the Medical Corps. His posture was straight, his voice gentle, his hands steady. Everything about him radiated the calm discipline of a man who had spent 2 years patching up the broken pieces the war kept shipping back to him. Before him sat a woman, 22, thin as wire, fever-bright eyes drifting in and out of awareness. Her name was Elise Weber, Luftwaffe auxiliary, captured near Rouen after her communications unit was overrun. She had arrived at Huntsville 3 weeks earlier, but her body had never quite recovered from the cold rain and forced marches of France. Now, sweat glistened across her brow, and her tangled hair, matted, knotted, almost dread-like, fell down her back in dark, neglected ropes. She didn't look like an enemy. She looked like someone history had forgotten to protect. Captain Reynolds dipped the wooden brush into a small bowl of warm water. The bristles darkened as they absorbed the heat. He tested the temperature on his wrist, like a father checking bathwater for a child, then approached her bedside. Every German woman in the room tensed. Elise didn't move. Her eyelids fluttered, half-conscious. She whispered something in German, too faint to catch. The officer didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Apology, confusion, fear. He said nothing. He simply reached out and, with infinite care, laid his hand on the first knot in her hair. The brush slid downward, slow, gentle, deliberate. A sound rose in the room, not a scream, not a gasp, but something softer, the sudden absence of breath. The German women froze. Two clutched their blankets. One, the youngest, 19, with freckles hidden under weeks of grime, covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Another pressed her face into her pillow, already shaking. No one spoke. They had seen American guards hand out extra blankets, yes. They had seen the cooks send them stew thicker than anything they'd eaten in years. They had even seen a medic share his cigarettes with one of the older prisoners who coughed through the night. But this? This was different. Back home, a woman's hair was private, sacred. It carried the memory of mothers, sisters, nights by the stove, childhood mornings when the world had not yet fallen apart. And no one had touched their hair with tenderness since 1940. Not after the conscriptions, not after the bombings, not after the Reich reduced every softness to a liability. Some had not been touched with kindness for even longer. The brush glided again, parting the strands with a soft, wet whisper. Captain Reynolds didn't rush. He didn't flinch when he reached a knot the size of his thumb. He didn't yank. He simply paused, dipped the brush again, and worked through it slowly, gently, as though the hair belonged not to an enemy but to someone he was afraid to hurt. Elise's lips parted. A single tear slid from the corner of her eye and disappeared into the pillow. Someone in the room let out a quiet sob. The officer didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the others. He only focused on the task in front of him, the way he had been trained to focus on wounds, fractures, fever charts. But this wasn't medical protocol. This wasn't in the Geneva Convention guidelines he'd memorized years earlier. The convention instructed him to provide proper hygiene, adequate care, humane treatment. But nowhere did it say he had to do it with kindness. Outside the infirmary, the war was still raging. American factories were building ships, planes, trucks faster than the Axis could destroy them. The arsenal of democracy churned without rest. In Germany, hospitals were collapsing under rubble, supplies were rationed by the ounce. But here, in a small wooden ward in Texas, the United States Army was doing something neither side had planned for. It was showing mercy. And mercy in 1944 was a shock. Another knot came free. The brush moved more easily now. One of the German women finally whispered, voice cracking, "Warum? Warum macht das? Why is he doing this?" No one could answer. But every woman in the room understood one thing with bone-deep clarity. Whatever they had been told about Americans was wrong. And for Elise, her fever slowly easing, the gentle pull of the brush was not just comfort. It was the first human tenderness she had felt in 4 long, brutal years. The officer kept brushing. The ward stayed silent, and history, quietly, almost imperceptibly, shifted. Elise Weber had not always been afraid of the sound of footsteps, the clink of metal tools, or the sight of a man in uniform. Once she had walked through Hamburg with her hair pinned neatly beneath a felt cap, a school book under one arm, believing the world, despite its hardships, still contained a place for innocence. But 4 years of war had eroded that belief grain by grain, until all that remained was a quiet, steady dread. It began long before Camp Huntsville, long before the fever that now kept her shaking beneath a wool blanket. It began in the classrooms of the Reich, where posters on the walls proclaimed the barbarity of the American soldier. Amerikaner sind Bestien. Americans are beasts. They were said to be men who drank, gambled, defiled women, mutilated prisoners, not trained soldiers but a rabble of criminals wearing a uniform too large for their character. Elise remembered the films shown in mandatory assemblies, wild-eyed GIs storming through villages, grabbing women by the hair, laughing as they torched homes. The message, repeated until it settled deep into her bones, was simple. Capture meant humiliation. Capture meant ruin. Capture meant a fate worse than death. So, when her communications unit outside Rouen collapsed under the weight of the Allied advance, and she was herded with 24 other Luftwaffe auxiliaries toward a line of American soldiers, her knees nearly buckled. She expected shouting, blows, rifle butts. Instead, a young corporal simply motioned them forward with a weary gesture, as though he had seen too much war to muster hatred for anyone else. Still, fear clung to her. It clung through the march to the temporary camp, through the crowded train ride toward the coast, through the 10-day Atlantic crossing aboard a Liberty ship where she slept in a hammock that swayed like a broken promise. The ship smelled of diesel, sweat, and seasickness, but beneath those odors was another smell. Soap. American soap. Strong, scented, unfamiliar. The guards washed their uniforms every few days. They brushed their teeth with real toothpaste. They shaved with creams that foamed like clouds. For the German women, whose last months in Europe had meant rationing soap to slivers, boiling water only on days the electricity hadn't been bombed out, and washing their hair with cold rainwater caught in tin cups, this abundance was almost insulting. It felt like mockery. When they arrived in Texas, that feeling intensified. Everything was too big, too loud, too confident. The sky, the fences, the trucks, the guards who walked with an ease that came from never having known hunger. They were fed immediately upon arrival, thick stew with real meat floating inside. Some refused to eat, convinced it was a trick. Others ate despite their fear, trembling with each bite. But nothing frightened Elise as much as the infirmary. The first time a medic touched her, she jerked away so violently that he nearly dropped his thermometer. She didn't understand the words he spoke. Slow, calm, steady. But she understood the gesture. He was trying to place something under her tongue. In the dim light of the ward, she saw only the glint of metal at the tool tray beside him and assumed the worst. Her breath came fast, sharp, frantic. He stepped back, palms raised, an expression of puzzled concern crossing his face. To him, she was a patient. To her, he was a danger. The other women were no better. When the nurses opened a small cabinet and removed scissors, combs, and bars of soap, an almost electric panic spread through the room. One woman whispered that the Americans were preparing to cut their hair as punishment. Another said they had heard stories. Women in occupied territories forced to stand in public squares while soldiers hacked off their braids. Humiliation was a weapon as old as war. Why would it be different here? The irony, of course, was that the American staff simply intended to clean them, treat their fevers, and rid them of lice, a routine procedure under both Army regulations and the Geneva Convention. But to women raised on Reich propaganda, the sight of a nurse approaching with scissors felt like a noose tightening around the throat. Elise felt the world tilt the moment she saw the metal glint. Her fever blurred the room around her, turning faces into smears of light and shadow. The sound of the beds creaking, the sterile scent of disinfectant, the brush of cold air from the drafty window, all of it merged into a dizzying sensory assault. When Captain Reynolds finally entered the ward and lifted the brush from his medical kit, she thought it was a blade. She recoiled, pressing herself into the mattress until the springs bit into her spine. The blanket tangled around her legs. Her breath hitched. Her eyes locked on the object in his hand. Wooden handle, dark bristles, and she trembled. Her mind filled in the rest. They will cut your hair. They will humiliate you. This is the punishment for losing the war. Her heart raced so fiercely she could hear it in her ears drowning out the quiet murmurs of the women around her. She saw him step closer, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She lifted her hands as if to protect herself, but her arms were too weak. Fever had drained all strength from her body. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she would faint from terror alone. The officer paused, clearly sensing her fear. He said her name gently, reading it from the tag attached to her medical chart. "Elise," he repeated, slower this time, as though the sound itself might calm her. But she had no context for such patience. In her world, orders were barked, not spoken softly. She squeezed her eyes shut. Around her, the other POW women watched with attention that crackled in the air like static. They whispered to one another, clutching their blankets. One of them muttered, "Er word is tune. Er word is tune. He's going to do it. He's going to do it." Because that was what they knew. That was what they had lived. In a Germany where water was scarce, where hospitals were rubble, where medicine arrived in dwindling drops, hair was not brushed. It was shorn, cut away in punishment or practicality. The idea that this American officer intended something else, something gentle, was too foreign to grasp. Elise opened her eyes at the exact moment the officer raised the brush, and her fear peaked so sharply that she let out a sound. A small, wounded cry that startled even herself. He froze. The entire ward froze. Her fear was absolute, pure, instinctual, and utterly wrong. It was the kind of fear that only collapses later, when kindness finally breaks through. For now, all she knew was the world she had come from, one where Americans were monsters, where captivity meant degradation, where every touch from an enemy was a prelude to cruelty. No one had told her that the world on this side of the ocean was different. No one had told her that America, despite its flaws, despite its war, still believed in mercy. And in that moment, shivering beneath a wool blanket in a Texas infirmary, Elise Weber had no way of knowing that the hand holding the brush was not raised to shame her, but to save her. Fear held her captive long before the Americans ever did, and only kindness would release her. Captain Samuel Reynolds had learned long ago that war didn't just break bones or tear flesh, it tangled people. It knotted their nerves, twisted their beliefs, matted their spirits until nothing felt salvageable. He had seen it in the young infantrymen who arrived from Italy, trembling from shell fire. He had seen it in the nurses who cried quietly in storage rooms so their patients wouldn't hear. And years before the war ever began, he had seen it in his own family, when his little sister, Anna, 8 years old and feverish, had lain still for days while he brushed her hair to keep it from tangling beyond repair. She had survived. Her hair had not. When it began to fall out in clumps from scarlet fever, she wept. And Sam, 12 at the time, learned the power of small tendernesses. A soft voice, a steady hand, a brush drawn carefully through hair that barely held together. He carried that lesson with him through medical school, through enlistment, through North Africa and Sicily, and now to Camp Huntsville, Texas, where 3,000 German POWs lived behind barbed wire but under humane treatment the Geneva Convention demanded. So, when he saw Elise Weber's hair, a dark, hopeless snarl of knots and sweat and neglect, he did not see a prisoner. He saw a patient. He saw a human being in pain. He saw his sister. He understood immediately that it couldn't wait. Matted hair bred lice, fungus, and infection. The heat of a Texas winter, still warm by European standards, only made it worse. Most POWs handled their own grooming under supervision, but these women had arrived half-starved and fever-ridden. Their hair had been the first casualty of exhaustion. A nurse, Lieutenant Harris, approached tentatively with scissors. "Sir, it might be easier just to cut it. She's burning up. Less stress on her." Sam shook his head almost before she finished speaking. "No, cutting it will frighten her more." "How do you know that?" He hesitated. "Because she flinched when she saw the metal, and because she keeps touching her hair when she wakes. It matters to her." The nurse lowered the scissors. Sam reached instead for the brush he had sterilized earlier. Wooden, sturdy, American Army issue. One of thousands manufactured effortlessly by a nation whose factories were still running at full tilt, churning out not only rifles and bombers but also combs, soap, blankets, toothbrushes. Things Germany had forgotten to value or simply could no longer afford to produce by 1944. He dipped the bristles into warm water mixed with a bit of carbolic soap. The scent rose faintly, clean and sharp, nothing like the acidic ersatz substitutes Elise had known in Europe. To her, the smell might have felt alien, even hostile. To Sam, it meant hygiene, recovery, control. He approached her slowly. Elise tracked his movement through half-lidded eyes, her fever burning her vision into a blur. Her breath trembled. She didn't recoil this time, too exhausted even for fear. But her fingers twitched toward her hair as though she expected him to rip it away. He didn't speak, not at first. Words might only confuse her. Instead, he knelt. Gently, with the back of his hand, he brushed a strand from her cheek. Elise inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. "It's all right," he murmured, more to the air than to her. "I'm not here to hurt you." He placed the brush at the top of the first knot, pressed gently, drew downward. The sound was soft, like the tearing of fragile thread, but the brush did not rip. It slid. Slowly, painstakingly. When it snagged, he loosened the knot with his fingers first. His hands were warm from the basin. Her skin was cold with fever. Behind him, the German women watched, faces tight, hands clasped around blankets as though clutching them would keep their fear from spilling. No one breathed too loudly. Some had grown accustomed to the American Guard's restrained demeanor, the regular meals, the medical examinations. But this was different. This was intimate. When the brush glided again, one of the women gasped so quietly it was almost a hiccup. Another covered her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes without warning. Sam kept brushing. He had no idea he was being watched. He wasn't thinking about the other POWs, or the nurses behind him, or the regulations that said nothing about this but certainly didn't forbid it. His world had narrowed to the shape of Elise's hair, the gentle resistance of each knot, the small shivering sound she made when the brush reached the tender spots behind her ears. At one point her hand lifted weakly as though she meant to stop him. He caught it lightly and placed it back on the blanket. Her fingers curled, trusting despite themselves. "Good," he whispered. "Just rest." The transformation was slow but visible. The first few strokes turned snarls into strands. The next few revealed the natural shine beneath the weeks of dirt. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders softened. Fever still raged through her body, but the tension, the tight coil of terror that had lived in her spine since capture, began to release. Another knot gave way. Another breath eased. Another tear slipped silently down Elise's cheek. The nurse stepped closer, voice hushed. "Sir, I've never seen them so quiet." Sam didn't answer. He didn't look up. Truthfully, he wasn't brushing hair. He was untangling war. Behind him, one POW whispered, "Es ist nicht möglich." It isn't possible. Another shook her head, whispering back, "Warum tut das?" Why would he do that? A third, older woman, her voice trembling. "Because this is America." Sam didn't hear the exchange, but if he had, he might have blushed. He reached a particularly stubborn knot near the nape of Elise's neck. It was thick, painful, just a touch. Elise winced reflexively, and Sam paused, held the hair with one hand, stroked it gently with the other, just enough to reassure her. "It's all right," he said softly. "I won't hurt you." For the first time, Elise murmured something audible. Not a word, just a sound, fragile and wounded, the kind a child might make when trying not to cry. Sam swallowed. "Just a little more," he said. He worked that knot for nearly a minute until it finally loosened, giving way like a clenched fist releasing. Her whole body seemed to exhale. He brushed again. This time the hair fell smoothly. Elise's eyes fluttered, not in pain now, but in something closer to disbelief. A soft, stunned relief. She wasn't used to touch meaning safety. She wasn't used to the idea that an enemy could be gentle. The other women were crying openly now, not sobbing, not loudly, just tears sliding down cheeks unused to softness. One covered her face. Another stared at the floor as though ashamed to witness tenderness between enemy and prisoner. Sam placed the brush aside and soaked a towel in warm water. He wrung it out until it no longer dripped, then wiped gently along Elise's hairline, where sweat had dried in salty streaks. She leaned into the touch without realizing it. "There," he whispered. "Much better." He wasn't speaking to impress her. He wasn't performing for the nurses. He simply cared, because someone had to. And in 1944, when the world was burning, caring for an enemy was an act of rebellion, and an act of profound American decency. For Elise, it was more than that. It was the first time in 5 long years that another human being had touched her without taking something away. She felt the warmth of his hand, the softness of the towel, the absence of pain. And for the first time since her capture, maybe for the first time since the war began, she let herself believe that kindness still existed, that perhaps everything she had been taught about these Americans, these supposed barbarians, was wrong. Sam set the brush down gently on the bedside table. The bristles were dark, tangled with what he had undone. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we'll wash it properly." Elise closed her eyes. A single tear slipped into her hair. Not from fear, not from shame, but from the shock of learning that even in war, even in captivity, mercy could still reach her. And it had arrived in the simple, steady motion of an American officer brushing her hair. For a long moment after Captain Reynolds set the brush down, the infirmary remained suspended in silence. Not the alert silence of fear, nor the dutiful silence of soldiers obeying orders. This was a silence so fragile it felt as if a single breath might shatter it. Elise lay still, her freshly brushed hair spread like dark silk across the pillow, her eyes half open but unfocused, as though she were drifting between 2 worlds. Then something inside her broke. It didn't happen with a scream or a gasp. It happened with a tremor, small at first, barely noticeable. Her fingers curled, her chin quivered. The breath she tried to steady slipped out unevenly. And then, without warning, her shoulders collapsed and a sob tore from her throat, raw enough to echo against the metal bed frame. Captain Reynolds froze. The nurse at the far end of the room turned sharply. Every POW woman stiffened as if the sound were a blade slicing through the air. Elise covered her face with both hands, muffling herself as if ashamed of the noise. But shame couldn't contain what was rising inside her. Months of terror, years of deprivation, the weight of grief she had carried since childhood. It all surged upward until her body shook under the force of it. She was not crying from pain. She was crying because kindness, simple, unadorned kindness, had struck her harder than any weapon. Reynolds stepped closer, uncertain, and lowered himself to sit at the edge of her cot. "Hey," he whispered, almost afraid of the sound of his own voice. "You're all right. No one's hurting you." But Elise shook her head violently beneath her hands, tears leaking between her fingers. She wanted to speak, to explain the storm inside her, but the words came in fragments. Broken German, strangled English, fevered breaths that tangled into each other. "Warham," she choked. Why do this? You are my enemy." The last word cracked in half as it left her lips. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He had seen soldiers break down before, men twice her size, men hardened by combat. But this was different. This was the collapse of someone who had been holding herself together with threads. One of the other POW women, Marta, sat up in her bed, gripping her blanket as if steadying herself. She stared at Elise with wide, shimmering eyes. "She doesn't understand," Marta whispered toward the officer, her accent thick but her meaning unmistakable. "None of us do." Elise dropped her hands then. Her face was blotched with heat, streaked with tears, her breaths sharp and shallow. She tried again to speak. "My father," she said, her voice cracking. "Bomb. Hamburg." She pressed trembling fingers to her temples as if the memory itself were a physical wound. "He died. In the cellar. I was 17. Reynolds' expression softened. He had heard that story before, from civilians, from refugees, from prisoners of war. The terror of the bombing raids lived permanently in the eyes of anyone who had survived them. But hearing it from a woman, barely more than a girl, here in a Texas infirmary, felt different. Elise continued, speaking in short bursts, as if her memories were too heavy to carry all at once. "My mother, she starved. Winter of 42. She gave her food to me. I told her not to. She did anyway." Her throat closed around the last word. "After she died, no one ever touched my hair again. Not once. 5 years, no one." Her hand lifted weakly, brushing the newly freed strands across her shoulder. She stared at them as if they belonged to a stranger. "I forgot what it felt like," she whispered. Across the ward, a second POW woman suddenly covered her mouth and began crying into her blanket. Another leaned forward, elbows on knees, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. "I don't remember the smell of soap," one murmured. "Real soap. My mother used to wash my hands with lavender soap. I haven't smelled anything like that since 1939. A fourth woman, the youngest in the group, drew her legs up to her chest. "I saw the warm water," she said in a shaky voice, "and I thought it was a trick. In Frankfurt we had no heat, no water. I haven't felt warm water on my skin in years." Their voices overlapped, quiet confessions tumbling into the open now that the dam had broken. Reynolds stood there, listening, something tightening in his chest. He knew the statistics. By 1944, nearly 1/3 of women in Germany suffered malnutrition. Hot water was a luxury. Soap was rationed to crumbs. Hospitals ran without electricity for days at a time. Yet hearing these truths not as distant facts but as lived grief, that was something else. The contrast to America was almost obscene. Here in Texas, hot water ran freely. Soap was stocked in crates. Medical supplies overflowed from storerooms. The infirmary had enough gauze, disinfectant, and morphine to treat hundreds. The United States, its factories humming, its agriculture booming, its infrastructure unbroken, had enough resources to care for its enemies in ways Germany could no longer care for its own civilians. Reynolds felt the weight of that knowledge. The women felt it too, though differently. To them, this place defied logic, abundance without cruelty, strength without brutality, power without humiliation. It dismantled everything they had been taught. Elise clutched the blanket with white knuckles. "They told us you were monsters," she whispered to Reynolds. "They told us Americans were wild, drunken men who would shame us. They said surrendering was worse than dying." Reynolds exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry they told you that." She shook her head. "I believed it, all of it, until today." Her gaze drifted toward the bedside table where the brush lay drying on a towel. The sight of it triggered fresh tears. "That brush?" She swallowed. "I thought you would cut my hair, make me stand in front of the others, punish me. That's what soldiers do where I come from." She didn't mean it as an accusation. She meant it as a confession of the world she had lived in. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't in the manual," he said gently. "Sometimes it's just what a human being should do." Elise stared at him, her breath trembling, her expression caught between disbelief and dawning comprehension. She wanted to answer, but exhaustion pressed her down into the mattress again. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but the force behind them had shifted. These were not the sharp tears of terror. They were the softer, heavier tears of release. A sigh escaped her lips, one that carried years of tension. The other POW women watched her, and something inside them broke open as well. Not just fear, not just memory, but the rigid, brittle shell propaganda had built around their understanding of the world. Marta wiped her cheeks with the corner of her blanket. "We were told America hated us," she said. "But I think we never understood your country at all." Another woman added, "Look at this place. Lights, clean water, medicine. You treat us better than Germany treats its own people now." Someone else murmured, "If the Americans wanted to be cruel, they could be, but they aren't." There was no anger in their voices, only stunned realization. Reynolds felt something shift in the room, a collective exhale, a surrender not of duty, but of fear. These women had lived through bombings, starvation, propaganda, and the constant threat of humiliation. Now, confronted with an act of tenderness so ordinary it would barely merit notice in peacetime, they were unraveling. And in that unraveling, the truth emerged. America's greatest power wasn't its factories or its armies. It was its mercy. For Elise, that truth hit hardest. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the infirmary lamp bathe her face. The tears slowed. Her breathing steadied. A thought rose in her mind. Quiet, fragile, unthinkable only an hour earlier. If this is the enemy, then what does that make the world I came from? Outside, the wind rustled across the Texas grasslands. The camp lights glowed steady against the winter dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed, a promise of heat, water, electricity, stability, a promise Germany could no longer make. The weight of that contrast settled over the room, deeper than grief, sharper than fear. And as Elise drifted into exhausted sleep, her last waking thought was not of home, or of war, or of loss. It was of the gentle pull of a brush through her hair, a mercy she never imagined the world still contained. Night came softly to Camp Huntsville, settling over the rows of wooden barracks with a hush that made the whole compound feel suspended in time, caught somewhere between war and the faint memory of peace. The infirmary lights glowed through the windows in warm rectangles, casting long shapes across the dirt pathway. Crickets hummed outside. The occasional clank of a distant gate drifted through the cool Texas air. Inside, the ward was quiet. The women who had cried earlier now slept in fitful but deeper rest, their breath rising and falling in imperfect unison. Only Elise remained awake, her fever reduced to a warm pulse beneath her skin. She stared at the ceiling beams, still feeling the ghost of the brush through her hair, still unsure how the world had managed to turn upside down in a single evening. She didn't hear Captain Reynolds approach until he was beside her bed, pulling up the metal chair with a low scrape. He sat down slowly, careful not to wake the others. For a moment, neither spoke. They listened to the creaking of beds, the rustle of blankets, the muted hum of the building's heater. Then he said quietly, "You scared me today." Elise turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with hesitant eyes. "I scared myself," she whispered. He smiled faintly, tired but kind, the sort of smile that had nothing to prove. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk," he said, "but sometimes, after a breakdown like that, it helps." She swallowed. "Why?" "Because I've been there," he answered. He folded his hands, resting his elbows on his knees. The lamplight softened the lines on his face, making him look older than his 32 years, older in the way men looked when they had carried the weight of too many others. "I'm from Oklahoma," he began. "Small town, red dirt, wheat fields, neighbors who know your business before you do." His voice held both affection and ache. "My father was a mechanic. My mother ran the kitchen like a general. And my little sister, she got sick when we were kids. Fever, bad one." He glanced toward Elise's pillow where the brush now rested. "I used to sit by her bed for hours, brush her hair so it wouldn't tangle. She said it made her feel human, even when she couldn't stand on her own." Elise blinked slowly. Something in her chest loosened. Not the violent release of earlier tears, but a gentler unraveling, like a knot easing. "That's why you did it," she said. Sam nodded. "It wasn't regulation, but it was right." She studied his face. "And why did you join the army?" He leaned back slightly, exhaling. "Everyone I knew signed up. In 41, it felt like the whole country stood still, listening to the radio after Pearl Harbor. My mother cried. My father went quiet. And I guess I felt like I had to help put the world back together, not tear anyone apart." He shrugged lightly. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I wanted to end the war faster, save more lives. That's why I went into medicine. Healing felt like the only sane job left." Elise absorbed his words, letting them settle into the spaces where fear once lived. She had imagined American soldiers as swaggering brutes, men who drank, shouted, destroyed without thought. But this man in front of her had nothing of that in him. He looked like someone who had carried too many burdens and still found room for compassion. She drew a breath, steady but fragile. "In Germany, things were different." He nodded, encouraging her. "I had a normal childhood once," she began softly. "Before the war, before everything." She let the memory unfurl slowly, cautiously, as if afraid touching it would hurt. "We lived near the Elbe. My mother baked bread every Sunday. My father read the newspaper aloud. I played in the courtyard with other children." Her voice thinned, but then came the bombings, the sirens, the ration cards. What little we had became less each year. My father died when the house collapsed in 43. My mother starved herself so I could eat. Sam's jaw tightened with empathy, but he didn't interrupt. "I joined the Luftwaffe Auxiliary because it meant food, lodging, I didn't want to fight, I just wanted to survive. She touched her hair lightly, still astonished by its softness. But I never expected to survive this way. Sam tilted his head, studying her with that same calm steadiness. You thought we'd be cruel. Yes. Elise didn't try to soften it. We were told Americans were soft, decadent, immoral, but also brutal, savage when angered. We believed surrendering to you was a curse. And now? He asked. She met his eyes, clearer now, not clouded by fever or terror. Now, I don't know what to believe. A quiet laugh escaped him. That's all right. Most of us are trying to figure things out, too. She smiled for the first time. A small, uncertain thing, but real. It made her look younger, almost like the girl she had been before the world fractured. Sam leaned back in the chair, stretching his legs. Do you know how many Americans are serving right now? She shook her head. 12 million, he said. Out of a country of 140 million. That's more people in uniform than your entire population over 16. And back home? The factories are still running, full speed. Last year we produced 96,000 airplanes. This year, even more. Her eyebrows lifted, part confusion, part awe. We built 8 million tons of ships, he added. Liberty ships, tankers, transports. One every few days. That's impossible, she murmured. No, he said gently. That's America. There was pride in his voice, but not arrogance. It was the pride of a man who believed in the strength of his people. Not because they were perfect, but because they tried to be good. Elise looked at the rows of beds, at the clean sheets, at the small basin still steaming with warm water. We never had this, she whispered, even before the war, even when things were better. Every family in my town helped each other, Sam said. If someone was sick, neighbors brought food. If a farmer lost a barn, everyone came with hammers. It's the America I grew up in, and maybe the America I hope still exists. She studied him with a softened gaze. You talk like my father used to, before everything went wrong. He smiled faintly. Maybe our fathers wouldn't have been so different. Silence settled again, but it was no longer fragile. It was warm, shared, a silence built not from fear, but from understanding. Two people, once enemies only because government said so, now sat together in the dim glow of a Texas infirmary, holding the fragile thread of human connection between them. Elise's eyelids grew heavy. Will you brush it again tomorrow? She asked, embarrassed by the smallness of the question. Sam nodded. If you'll let me. She gave the smallest nod, then closed her eyes, trusting sleep in a way she hadn't trusted anything for years. As her breathing evened, Sam watched her for a moment longer. He wasn't thinking about the POW regulations, or the medical protocols, or the war raging half a world away. He was thinking about how strange and fragile humanity was, and how easily people could forget that their enemies were just people too. He stood slowly, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Her face softened in sleep. The hardness worn into her features now faded. Before he left the ward, he glanced back once more. She looked peaceful. He felt something like hope. Two human beings, separated by nations, ideology, and war, had somehow met in the narrow space where empathy survived. And in 1944, that space was a miracle. Elise's recovery unfolded not in a dramatic sweep, but in a series of quiet, almost ordinary miracles. Small gifts of humanity that accumulated like drops of warm water slowly dissolving the ice around her soul. The first miracle was the bath. 3 days after her collapse, when her fever finally gave way to a steady warmth rather than burning spikes, Lieutenant Harris helped her out of bed and guided her toward the small washing room at the back of the infirmary. Elise hesitated at the doorway, clutching the thin towel with both hands. In Germany, especially during the last year of the war, bathing had become a rare privilege. Water pipes were shattered in half the cities. Fuel was scarce. Hot water belonged only to memories. But here, the moment Harris turned the knob, steam filled the air. Warm water cascaded into a metal basin, rising and swirling, catching the lamplight as if it were liquid silver. Elise felt tears prick her eyes before she even stepped inside. She touched the water with the tips of her fingers and jerked back, not from pain, but from disbelief. "It's all right," the nurse said with a smile. "There's plenty." Plenty. The word meant nothing and everything. Harris washed her hair gently, using a fragrant American shampoo, lavender and something sweet Elise couldn't identify. With each rinse, the scent filled the room, and Elise felt something inside her loosen again, the way knots loosen with soap and warmth. When the water slid down her back, she shivered, but the shiver wasn't from fear. It was recognition, a forgotten sensation of being cared for, of being tended to rather than used or dismissed. As Harris finished, she handed Elise a clean towel. "You look more alive already." Elise didn't know how to answer. She stared at herself in the small mirror above the basin. Her face was pale but smoother, her eyes clearer. Her hair, untangled now, shining in the dim light, fell softly over her shoulders. She looked like someone she had lost long ago. The second miracle was food, not the watery cabbage soup of rationed Germany, nor the stale bread that tasted of dust and anxiety. Here, meals came regularly: eggs scrambled with butter, soft rolls, slices of apple, warm broth rich with flavor. Her body responded quickly, greedily. After weeks of deprivation, every nutrient felt like sunlight poured directly into her veins. She regained strength, color, even a hint of fullness in her cheeks. The third miracle was sleep. Deep, uninterrupted sleep, without sirens, without artillery, without the dread that someone might pound on the door in the middle of the night shouting, "Luftschutzkeller." She slept like a child for the first time in years. And the fourth miracle, perhaps the greatest, was trust. It revealed itself one afternoon when Captain Reynolds returned for his rounds. Elise was sitting up for the first time without trembling. Her hair, freshly washed, still framed her face with a softness that startled her each time she touched it. She looked toward him with a tentative but genuine smile. "You look better," he said, pulling up the familiar chair. "I feel different," she answered. He nodded. "That's what happens when the body finally gets what it needs: food, rest, clean water, peace." Peace. That word hung in the air like a fragile ornament, something too delicate for wartime, yet undeniably present here. After a pause, Elise spoke again. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted the blanket in her lap. "I have been thinking," she said, "about all of this." Reynolds waited. Elise lifted her eyes, meeting his without fear. "Everything they told us about you," she said slowly, "was a lie. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even anger. It was the quiet revelation of someone standing in the ruins of an old belief, realizing the foundation was sand." Reynolds exhaled, leaning back slightly. His expression shifted, relief mixed with something like sadness. "Propaganda works that way," he said, "on both sides. Tells people what to fear, tells them who to hate." "But you don't hate us," Elise said, almost incredulous. He shook his head. "No. Hatred doesn't end wars. It only makes them last longer. Kindness He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Kindness is also a weapon," he said finally. "We just choose to use it differently." Elise absorbed the sentence, letting it settle into the deepest parts of her. She thought of her father's warnings, of leaflets distributed through German barracks, of posters depicting Americans as savages. She thought of the young girls beside her in the infirmary who had flinched at the sight of scissors, who had wept at the smell of soap. Germany had taught them to see the world in terms of enemies. America, strangely, unbearably, was teaching them to see the world in terms of people. "I don't understand how you can treat us this way," she whispered. "We are prisoners." Reynolds glanced toward the window, where camp lights flickered beyond the bars. "Do you know," he said slowly, "that 99% of German POWs in America survive the war? The highest survival rate anywhere. We have tents and barracks full of men, healthy, fed, working. They'll go home when this is over, and most of them, they won't hate us when they do." "Why?" she asked again. "Because America isn't fighting to destroy Germans," he said. "We're fighting to stop an idea that's destroying everyone else, including you." Elise felt a sting in her chest, not from pain, but from recognition. All her life, she had been told Germany was strong, righteous, destined to shape the world. But strength alone had not fed her mother. Righteousness had not saved her father. Destiny had not kept her warm when the sirens wailed in the night. And here, in a country she had been taught to despise, strangers had washed her hair, fed her soup, and brushed her tears away without asking anything in return. America had every reason to hate her. Instead, it had saved her. She lowered her gaze. "I wish my mother could see this," she said quietly. "She used to tell me the world could still be kind. I didn't believe her. Not anymore. But now—" Her voice broke gently. She covered her mouth as a tear slipped free. Reynolds reached out, not touching, not assuming, but offering the presence of someone willing to stand in the quiet storm with her. "You're alive," he said. "That's what matters now. When you go home, you'll carry something with you, something bigger than this war." She nodded slowly. "I will tell them," she whispered. "I will tell everyone that you treated us like human beings, better than we were treated at home." A long silence passed, warm, reverent. Outside, the generator hummed again, the sound steady and sure, like a heartbeat of the camp itself. For a moment, Elise imagined thousands of POWs across the United States, working on farms, repairing fences, reading books in barracks libraries, men who would one day return to Germany with stories their children and grandchildren would scarcely believe. Stories like hers. "If not for America," she murmured, almost to herself, "I would be dead." Reynolds didn't contradict her. He simply nodded, because both of them knew it was true, and both knew the truth carried a weight that would outlive them. For Elise, moral awakening did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like sunrise, slow, gentle, illuminating the world 1 inch at a time. And by the time the light reached her fully, she was no longer the girl Germany had shaped. She was someone new, someone the war had broken and America had begun to heal. Nearly 40 years after the war ended, a museum archivist in Texas opened a cardboard box marked Camp Huntsville, Medical Wing, and found an object that startled him with its simplicity: an old wooden hairbrush. The bristles were worn, the handle darkened with age. Tucked beneath it was a folded sheet of paper, thin, yellowed, written in careful German cursive. He unfolded it gently. "A U.S. officer brushed my hair when I was a prisoner. From that single act, my entire understanding of the world changed. Elise Weber, 1944. The archivist didn't know her story then. Not the fever, not the breakdown, not the night in the infirmary when kindness pierced through years of fear. But he knew enough to place the brush into a small display case next to a placard that read, "Used in the infirmary, Camp Huntsville, 1944. For decades, visitors passed by the case without knowing the full weight behind the object. Some assumed it belonged to a nurse. Others thought it might have been used by American soldiers stationed at the camp. Only a few paused long enough to imagine a German POW girl sitting weak and feverish while an American officer knelt beside her, gently untangling the knots war had left behind. In the early 2000s, the rest of the story came to light. A woman in her late 30s, Elise's granddaughter, arrived from Bremen with a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in paper. She had flown across the Atlantic for the first time in her life. She carried with her a copy of Elise's journal, passed down through the family like an heirloom. She walked the grounds where the barracks once stood, tracing the outline of foundations long erased by time. When she reached the approximate location of the infirmary, she knelt and placed the flowers on the earth. A security guard approached her gently. "Ma'am, are you visiting someone?" She stood, wiping her eyes. "My grandmother," she said. "She was a prisoner here." He looked surprised. "I didn't know prisoners' families still came." She nodded. "We come because America saved them. If not for this place, I wouldn't be alive." Later that afternoon, she entered the small museum and froze when she saw the brush. Her hand lifted to her mouth. "Oma," she whispered. She reached into her purse and pulled out the journal. The page that had always mattered most to their family was marked with a ribbon. "Kindness became my freedom." Below it, in smaller handwriting, Elise had added years later, "War did not end the moment Germany surrendered. War ended for me when an American taught me what mercy looked like." Her granddaughter stood before the exhibit for nearly an hour, reading the letter aloud in fragments to the empty room. The archivist listened from behind the doorway, moved in a way he had not expected. When she finished, she rested her palm against the glass of the display case. "Thank you," she whispered, not to him, not to the museum, but to a man whose name had faded into the archives, known only by the signature on a few medical reports, Captain Samuel J. Reynolds, U.S. Army Medical Corps. Stories like Elise's spread quietly through post-war Germany. Stories of POWs who returned home healthier than when they left, who remembered American farms where they repaired fences, American churches where they sat in the back during Sunday services, American soldiers who offered cigarettes instead of blows. By the 1950s, the myth of the American barbarian had dissolved entirely among former prisoners. Instead, something else took its place. Gratitude. Families like Elise's grew up with a strange kind of reverence for a nation that had been their enemy. A reverence rooted not in power or conquest, but in everyday decency. It's why her granddaughter stood there that day, crying over a brush behind museum glass. Because America, in 1944, had been something extraordinary, a country that fed its enemies better than their own homeland could feed its citizens, a country that treated 370,000 German POWs with dignity, and saw a 99% survival rate, the highest of any nation in the war, a country whose industrial might built 96,000 planes in a year, but whose heart built something more enduring, trust. And trust is what Elise carried home. She married a schoolteacher. She raised children who grew up without hatred. She taught them English before they learned French. And every Christmas, without fail, she told the same story. An American brushed my hair when I was a prisoner. He saved more than my life. He saved the part of me that still believed the world could be kind. If Americans today walked through that museum, many might feel a familiar ache, a longing for an America they believe has slipped away. An America remembered not just for strength, but for character, for generosity, for moral confidence, for the courage to choose compassion when cruelty would have been easier. When viewers hear Elise's story, they inevitably compare the America of 1944 to the America of today. We were once a country that showed mercy even to our enemies. Greatest Generation didn't just win battles, they won the moral battle. We used to feed strangers. Now we barely listen to our neighbors. But perhaps the truest comparison isn't meant to shame. Perhaps it is meant to remind. In a time when public discourse feels fractured, when divisions run deep, when cynicism is easier than hope, the story of a German POW girl having her hair brushed by an American officer offers something rare, a reason to believe that America can still be what it once was. That decency is not a relic, that kindness is still a choice, that a nation's greatness isn't found in its weapons, but in its mercy. Today, the brush remains in its glass case, illuminated by a soft museum light. Beside it lies a small handwritten label, "Used in the Infirmary, 1944." And taped gently to the edge of the display is a copy of Elise Weber's last note, printed in both German and English. "Kindness became my freedom." It is the simplest legacy a prisoner could leave behind, and the most powerful reminder of the country that gave it to her.